Shawn, you wanted to talk a little bit about Dynasty rookie drafts, and you wrote a piece where you predicted the draft order in FFPC, Triflex leagues, Superflex, tight end premium. And it's really interesting. And I think we should definitely talk through it. The first name that sticks out to me is Treylon Burks, who we were talking about as potentially the 101. You're thinking he might be more in this 106 range in some of these drafts. But talk through your methodology a little bit first.
Yeah, well, I've done this for the last couple of years, and it's pretty helpful to me because when I see the community going in a different... So again, these aren't my rankings. This is just what I think is going to happen. And when the community goes in a different direction than what I think is going to happen, that actually provides me some info. Now, a lot of listeners will know that I'm not on Twitter. I'm not getting quite the barrage of info and outside perspectives that some other people are. Every once in a while, that can be a disadvantage. A lot of times it's an advantage to me because I'm able to think through what I expect in a vacuum before I have spoilers and can no longer do that without this informational leakage or contamination, I should say. And that part is interesting. I was kind of blown away, and I don't want everything to come back to Jonathan Taylor and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, but even after Edwards-Helaire was drafted first and drafted into this fantastic situation, I thought that the community was still going to have Jonathan Taylor number one because he was just so good. And I thought there was a little bit of an exploitable element in terms of how I could move around in drafts when I found out that that wasn't going to happen. There are lots of little things like that. And so I like to do this, even if it's just for me, but obviously I put it out for the subscribers and see what's going to happen there. The thought on Treylon Burks is that people were suggesting that he could go in the second round, and you probably know better than I in terms of where that was really being driven. Now, we do know that there were some people in the sort of scouting community who were pushing that down. You're getting the sense that you're hearing from NFL decision makers that maybe there were some teams that were reluctant. And he did go as the last guy in this sort of big group. At the same time, it seemed like there were a lot of fantasy analysts who were also willing to, once they got any kind of coverage for that, and I'm not saying that and all I mean by that is just that their own take was being confirmed a little bit by maybe some scouting takes and some, info from GMs that they're like, yeah, this is a little bit where I have him too. And so the fact that he does go at the end of that group, he goes into a situation that might not be very pass heavy and could have some quarterback controversy. That doesn't necessarily help any wide receiver. It doesn't really help a young player. I think that there are going to be people who are still, and the guys in front of him, right? I mean, you're talking about Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Jameson Williams. We were joking with Pat on the show that, Kenneth Walker, very good potential pick at the 102. So it's not like anybody controversial actually has to be pushed ahead of Treylon Burks for him to go 106.
Yeah, it's sort of that first tier. You have Breece in your list. You have Breece Hall, Drake London, Kenneth Walker, Garrett Wilson, Jameson Williams, and then Burks at 106. To your point about, me being on Twitter, maybe I would have more information on this. I do feel like from what I've been seeing that he's probably not going to last to 106 in a lot of spots, that there seems to be a lot of optimism about the landing spot. I think the consensus will have him up over Garrett Wilson and probably over Jameson Williams as well. And so maybe 104-ish is I don't think you're wrong that Drake London will probably be ahead of him. And the Kenneth Walker thing is the other really interesting one, right? Where will he fit in among these receivers? In some drafts, he might fall all the way to 106. In others, he might go 102. It kind of depends on how running back heavy your league is. I think there will be leagues as well where Breece Hall doesn't even go 101, and either London or Burks are the two that I've heard from people that they want at 101. And so they think the ceiling for those guys in their landing spots are good enough and immediately good enough in these passing offenses in Atlanta and Tennessee where there's not a ton of competition that it can justify taking them over Breece Hall. But I think for most, you're right on Breece Hall 101. I think you're right on London and 102 and probably Walker 103. I think Burks, as you say that, and I think through what I've been seeing on Twitter, that's sort of why I wanted to ask. That might be one where you do get some information and learn that the community is now reacting pretty heavily to the landing spot and the willingness to trade away A.J. Brown and basically immediately replace him with Burks. It was such a tailor-made narrative that they think they're doing a one-for-one trade in that replacement, that there seemed to be a lot more optimism from Burks since that move that I've seen on Twitter than there was in the week or so leading up to the draft when things really started to get bleak and people were talking about Treylon Burks being, undraftable, I think, in all formats. But
well, Ben, let me wrap it back around real quick for this Marquis Brown discussion, because you had mentioned that you wanted Brown more. And again, this is for redraft. You wanted him more in that McLaurin Jeudy tier. How do you feel about? So, I mean, I'm saying that I think Burks could go 6. He did go 6 in the first draft that I'm in. A little note there, I'm sort of a mild Burks skeptic, had 2 of the first 5 picks. And so obviously that's going to affect where he goes. I had London and Burks with Mike Williams as the next couple of guys below Marquis Brown in that tier. And so I had them ahead of this tier that has McLaurin, Jeudy, Garrett Wilson, Gabriel Davis, Hunter Renfrow, Devontae Smith, Rashad Bateman, who I now love. Do you like the rookies in that tier, or do you think that's a little bit enthusiastic?
In the you're asking about the rookies in terms of Burks and London in the tier that you have them? Yeah, I do. I like them there. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. Whether you have Brown there or behind, I think the rookies definitely belong there. I was just making the case that maybe Brown should be the tier behind that, as you referenced. But I think I would like the rookies over Brown is the way that I would put it. I think Brown maybe fits somewhere in between, but I would prefer to take Burks and London in redraft over Marquis Brown, I think.
And just sort of as a note and a little bit of a promo here, we had the majority of our rankers still actually liked Burks number 2 overall in our rookie rankings summit the other night. So that's a pretty strong statement in terms of where we have him. The RotoViz rookie guide is out, volume 3. It's a lot of fun. Multiple super flex mocks, multiple 1QB mocks. You get our rankings. Go ahead and check that out. Ben, where are we going next?
Yeah, so that's sort of the end of a tier, right? And I think at 107, you had to be thinking about quarterback fitting in right away. You have Chris Olave at 107, and he's sort of that next half tier. I think most people have Olave behind those other top 4 receivers and have sort of throughout this process. And it's a question of whether he is next up or you fit in Kenny Pickett there, but you have Pickett at 108. And then I feel like it's sort of another teardrop, but you have Christian Watson 109 and Skye Moore 110. Now, a teardrop in terms of expected sort of perception of these players. And so you have Christian Watson and Skye Moore, who are the 2 big risers from landing spots. They come in just behind Pickett as the first QB and Olave. We will have more ahead of basically all 3 of those.
Ben says that, but we may not if you're drafting with us in our league. Don't be afraid to trade up. No, this is an interesting one because I was asking Monty Fawn, who plays a lot of FFPC. He plays all the different formats. He's a previous first place overall finisher in the regular season of the main event. Obviously, not too many people do that. He and I are doing a team together. And the question that I have here is, do we see situations in which Olave or Pickett could go in the top 6 picks and move down an interesting player? Ben, what are you seeing on this? So the Pickett thing, and we debated this a little bit in our ranking summit, but he almost has more value in Superflex. I mean, obviously more value overall, but when you're ranking him compared to the other rookie quarterbacks, more value. Because in 1 QB, you would never play him. And so you just prefer to take the risk on these guys who got drafted as backups. If they win the starting job, then they're exciting and they're playable. Pickett, never exciting, never playable in 1 QB. But in Superflex, you can easily not have a guy for the Superflex position. And if you don't have that, I mean, you can easily not have a starter. I have a league where the team is just incredible, in part because I haven't drafted or spent anything on quarterbacks. And so basically don't even have the first quarterback yet, right? So you can get to where you need someone in that position. People are going to be stockpiling those guys. They're going to be blocking you from those guys. Kenny Pickett is going to start probably almost right away. He's going to have a star receiver. He's going to have an interesting receiver in Chase Claypool. He's going to have a potential star in George Pickens. He's got one of our favorite tight ends in Pat Freiermuth. I mean, at some point you got to consider him, even if you actually don't like him, because he's going to play for a while. And in Superflex, I mean, most formats, even bad quarterbacks are going to score better than really good players at the other positions.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. There's that floor element where he's going to start. I mean, I don't know if he's going to start necessarily week one. We talked about that on the live stream. I suggested that was what I expected, but he's going to start a lot of his first season. They picked him 20th overall. I mean, I expected him to start week one, and he's probably going to start a lot of the next couple of seasons. You have some runway when a team takes a first round quarterback like this. And so sort of that floor of just having a quarterback, having the playing time, having a guy who's locked in for the next couple of years. There's veterans who aren't locked in for the next couple of years. People think they might be, but they're not. We find out every year that, the Baker Mayfields of the world may no longer be a starting quarterback in this NFL, based on just what happened in that offseason. Pickett, when you take him as a rookie, he's got a couple of years of runway to have some bumps in the road potentially. You're going to have a starting quarterback. He's going to maintain value in that way as well. And you've talked about this before, just based on being the starting quarterback going into the offseason, guys have value into the offseason, even if they weren't necessarily very good. And so he's going to be somebody that still has that potential as well with all those weapons to be good. And so, yeah, I think you have to be very optimistic about, maybe not very optimistic, but at least you have to recognize what he can provide in a super flex setting. Watson.
And so the contrast then is that I have the next couple of guys going as Corral at 204, Willis at 205. Again, in talking with some folks, I'm hearing that Willis is going earlier than that. Corral, someone we think could start right away. Some of these teams that are stuck, you feel like we're still going to see people just take the risk on the more exciting QBs anyway. I mean, you may not have that many picks, right? I mean, not every draft is set up to where you can just take your shots wherever you want. But those other quarterbacks still maintaining super flex relevancy that seem to be diminishing as we were going through days 2 and 3.
Yeah, it's really the rest of the quarterbacks are really, really interesting because I think it'd be pretty hard to argue that Willis gets the worst landing spot because he sits in behind Ryan Tannehill. Obviously, Corral comes in behind Sam Darnold. Ritter comes in behind Marcus Mariota. Even Sam Howell, who people are very low on, but he comes in behind Carson Wentz. I mean, these are all quarterbacks that these rookies could be in a position where the guy ahead of them is playing so bad that they have to bench him, right? They have no choice. They have to sit him down. And so that's not going to happen to Ryan Tannehill. Willis is more of a wait and see type, I think, as the Titans can get out of Tannehill's contract after this year, and he has a couple void years after next year. If it even took until after 2023, you're probably going to get Malik Willis playing at some point, and he has the most theoretical upside with his rushing ability and all of those things, the reasons that he was the QB1 pre-draft, but the landing spot is a little bit worse. And so, I mean, yeah, I think Corral, Ritter, Howell, there's good arguments to be taking shots on all of them with guys with some mobility, guys that I expect all three of those guys to play in 2023 or 2022, this year. At some point, to start some games at some point, just because those teams are not going to be particularly good. And, we expect their teams to be at least smart enough to recognize they want to see what they have in these guys. And that's useful. I mean, that could be a hit if they come out and they play really well, obviously. And so if I'm I don't know. I mean, it sort of depends on the roster. Like, how tough of a spot am I at quarterback? How tough of a spot am I at with the rest of my roster? Is quarterback the weak link? If quarterback's the weak link, then I probably want Pickett. I want somebody who's going to play, and I want to make quarterback as good as it can be so the rest of my roster can win for me. If the rest of my roster is shaky too, and I'm still sort of, maybe competitive this year, but also just sort of building, probably want those upside shots. Also still dependent on the league, though, because Pickett's going to maintain the most value as well. Is the lock to maintain the most value. So you might be able to trade Pickett next offseason as well if it's a very active league. And so, if your league values quarterbacks appropriately, I still would take Pickett at his cost ahead of these other guys. But I might prefer at cost the upside plays where you could potentially gain a ton of value. In your article, as you got down to Howell, who we liked a lot, we talked about a lot on the stream, you said this is the Hurts saga all over again because he was you wrote the best QB prospect in this draft, and we've talked on the show a lot about why that is the case and why you believe that, and you convinced me on that, and that he's playing behind Carson Wentz, which feels just like the Hurts thing. And Hurts was a very good value in Superflex leagues where you took him in that situation, and then he is now has gained a ton of value. And so that I think that situation exists for Howell, it exists for Ritter, it exists for Corral as well.
And at least the fun thing about Howell is that it doesn't really matter where you get drafted. If you get drafted, your team is probably going to see you on the practice field. And so all of these things that knocked him down, at least he's going to get to go out there and play. And if it's not a night and day difference between him and Carson Wentz in terms of how they look, then we're wrong, and that's fine. But at least he's going to get that shot. And so, it's now up to him to prove that he actually is kind of the guy. As you're kind of going through it there, Ben, one of the things that, again, just it keeps jumping out to me is how important these second round picks are in Superflex. People talked about this draft as being weak. I think from like the 107 to the 202, it feels pretty weak. And so this is kind of the situation where folks are talking about, okay, well, projecting forward, am I picking up a rookie pick from a team that I think is going to be good or a team that I think is going to be bad? Because there is some risk that you trade for a future first round pick and it ends up not being that exciting for you. Now, again, especially if you are a Chiefs or a Packers fan, you're probably going to get to take a shot on someone like Skye Moore or Christian Watson. I mean, how bad can that really be? But when we look at the second round, especially in Superflex, those picks are important because there's almost no way for it to work out that you're not going to get somebody there who helps your team and helps your structure. Because if you have this sort of apocalyptic event from the quarterback perspective, like we just went through this past weekend, that means you're going to be able to get those quarterbacks onto your team in the second round, which in Superflex is just a miracle for you. And if you don't have that, the quarterbacks are going to push guys down to you in the second round who are basically first round picks. And so it doesn't really matter which direction that goes. Those second round picks will still help you.
So this is such a fascinating rookie class. I think you did a good job here of putting it together where this is sort of, I think, going to be very close to where rookies are taken. At the same time, individual analysts are going to have opinions and their ranks are going to differ wildly from consensus in a lot of different ways, depending on, you're talking about the reasons at quarterback, it would depend on how heavily you value quarterbacks, because I think you can make the case that after Pickett goes in 108, and you talked about this kind of weak range, the late first and early second, that these other quarterbacks are their potential gain in value is worth enough to be then taking them in Superflex right there still at the late first, early second, which is interesting. And I've seen people rank it there. It's not just because, me pumping my bags of, we talked before the draft on my pre-draft rookie draft where I took both Ritter and Howell at 111 and 112. I've seen Ritter still ranked right in that range, not necessarily Howell, but if you're as high on Howell as we are, I think you could still argue from a value perspective in Superflex, the potential for him to gain if he does hit with Washington is enough that maybe he's worth that. Now, for Howell specifically, one other thing I wanted to add, I'm a little concerned about Taylor Heineke still being on the roster, who they do seem to like as a backup. And it might be one of those things where Howell winds up as the inactive third QB for parts of his rookie season, which would be really frustrating because we want him to at least be the backup and maybe then be the guy if Wentz is having a horrible game who gets to come on the field mid-game, as opposed to Heineke being treated as this veteran backup. And we see that sometimes, and that would be frustrating. But
it would be frustrating. I mean, I go back to practice. It's like, if you don't look better than those guys, and I like Tyler Heineke, but if you don't look better than those guys, then the team's like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what you fell. The other side is just that, that first day where he throws that 70-yard touchdown pass to Damian Brown, and Washington's like, oh, that's right. That's why we drafted that dude.
Yeah.
Like, if he actually is an NFL player,
we can get Damian Brown to look better. This will be great. But yeah, no, whether you put the quarterbacks up there, there's as you said it, if you're not putting them there, then they make a lot of sense in round 2, right? Especially you start to get to the middle and back half of round 2. You have Howell here at 302 as the last one. I mean, taking Howell at 302 is definitely a smart move, right? If you get that opportunity. The flip side of that is obviously that impacts the running backs and receivers and where they're going to slot. But also at running back and receiver, you have a lot of uncertainty. You have the top 2 running backs even going into committees with another talented back, not necessarily committees, but there's another talented back on the roster. You have Michael Carter and you have Rashad Penny on those rosters. And both offenses are not expected to be particularly great. They could be better than we expect. But when we're just sitting around looking at generic running back, whoever, one of the things we're looking for is, 1, does he have significant competition? And then 2, is the offense going to be good enough? I mean, you don't want to be in a situation where you have competition and the offense isn't very good, right? And so that wasn't great for those 2, but they still have a lot of value. But then behind that, you have, James Cook and Rachaad White, interesting names, land in interesting offenses. You have Damian Pierce here at 206 as the 5th running back. For the listeners, you had Cook and White right around the 1-2 turn. Damian Pierce lands in that situation in Houston where maybe he is the workhorse in year 1. And you have Tyrion Davis-Price at 212. He landed with San Francisco as the next back. Tyler Algier at 301. Brian Robinson, 304. Isaiah Spiller, 305. Any of those names could be ranked differently. You have Zamir White in the 3rd. Then I think the same is true at wide receiver. We can do this. We can play this game too, where the individual rankings at the position are not even clear for a lot of people. The top tier at wide receiver is not clear. We talked about that. The next tier is not clear. Where Jahan Dotson fits in, where George Pickens fits in as you get into this like 3rd tier. It feels pretty flat for guys like us down to the David Bells and the Wan'Dale Robinsons. And we might even rank them in, as we did on our live stream at the 1-2 turn. And then even a half tier behind that, where John Metchi comes in, you have him at 211 in this write-up. We don't really value him there. There's basically receivers that are in your 3rd round that we would like better than him. And so there's a lot of similar profiles at the different positions. The landing spots were mostly okay. Some of the better prospects got worse landing spots, it feels like, and some of the lower level prospects got some of the better spots. And so that narrowed the gap at some of the positions. Just talked about a running back. I talked about at quarterback with Malik Willis getting the worst spot and some of these other guys getting these spots where they could potentially start week 1 if they win out the job. It creates this dynamic this year where it feels really hard compared to prior years to place it. And a lot of things feel flat to me from stretches when I look at this list. There's a lot in this list that I don't think you're necessarily wrong to say people might have some of these guys valued there, but I'm like, I wouldn't pick this guy within a round of this. There's 12 more guys that I would rather take than this guy here. And so it's a really, really interesting year for rookie drafts. And I as you always say, it's a great year to have a lot of picks. It's a great year to be flexible and move around. You want to try to get as much value as possible. If you're in a lot of dynasty leagues, you definitely don't want to be just, overdrafting to get your guy, because you want to try to get your exposure to guys at the best prices across your portfolio as possible. I think we're going to be surprised with how far some guys drop in some of these rookie drafts.